The sun was rising at City Hospital when Nurse Jenny walked through the quiet halls. She was 32 years old, and everyone loved her because she took good care of all her patients. She always had a kind smile and made sure everyone was comfortable. That Tuesday morning in March was very quiet, with only the soft beeps of machines in the background. When Jenny went to check on room 15, she found something wrong. Mrs. Betty Smith, who was 68 years old and recovering from a hip operation, wasn't waking up for her morning medicine. Jenny's heart started beating fast when she checked Betty. Just yesterday, Betty was happy and talking about her grandchildren, but now she wasn't moving at all. Her skin felt cold. What scared Jenny most was that Betty was getting better. Nothing in her health records showed that this could happen. Dr. Mark, the hospital's best doctor, came running when Jenny called for help. He quickly said Betty died naturally, but something felt off about how calm he was. Jenny had worked with Dr. Mark for 5 years. He was always very professional, but today he was acting strange, too relaxed for a doctor who just lost a patient unexpectedly. Later that day, while Jenny was putting away Betty's things, she found a wrinkled note hidden in Betty's diary. The note was written shakily. Something feels wrong. The medicine Dr. Mark gave me last night was different from my usual pills. I don't feel right. Jenny's hands were shaking as she read this. She remembered how Dr. Mark had insisted on giving Betty her night medicine himself, which was odd, because important doctors usually don't do that. That night, Jenny couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Betty's last note, Dr. Mark's weird behavior, and something scary she was starting to notice. 3 other patients that Dr. Mark was taking care of had died suddenly in the last month, and they all showed the same signs before dying. As Jenny lay in bed looking at her ceiling, she made a big decision. Tomorrow, she would start looking into these deaths, no matter how dangerous it might be. The next morning, Jenny came to work early and went straight to the hospital records room. Her hands were sweating as she looked through the files of patients who had died. She found something strange. All the patients who died suddenly were rich and alone. They had no family nearby to ask questions. Betty was different because she had written that note, but the others hadn't left any clues. Jenny wrote down everything in her small blue notebook. Mrs. Rose Wilson, age 70, died 3 weeks ago. Mr. Tom Davis, age 65, died 2 weeks ago. And Mrs. Sarah Brown, age 72, died just last week. They all had simple surgeries that should have been safe. All of them got better at first, then suddenly died at night when Dr. Mark was working. While Jenny was writing, Lisa, a young nurse who had just started working at the hospital, came into the records room. "What are you doing here so early?" she asked. Jenny trusted Lisa because she was honest and kind. After making sure no one else was around, Jenny showed Lisa what she had found. Lisa's eyes got big as she read Jenny's notes. "Wait," Lisa whispered. "I saw something weird last week. Dr. Mark was putting something in Mrs. Brown's IV bag late at night. When I asked him about it, he said it was just extra vitamins." That afternoon, Jenny and Lisa carefully watched Dr. Mark. They noticed he spent a lot of time talking to his newest patient, Mr. Joe Green, a wealthy businessman who was in for knee surgery. Dr. Mark was being extra friendly with him, just like he had been with the others before they died. Jenny's stomach felt sick when she heard Dr. Mark tell Mr. Green, "Don't worry, I'll take special care of you myself." After their shift ended, Jenny and Lisa met at a coffee shop across from the hospital. "We need proof," Jenny said, stirring her coffee nervously. "But how do we get it without Dr. Mark knowing?" Lisa thought for a moment. Then her eyes lit up. "My brother Pete is a police detective. Maybe he can help us look into this quietly." Jenny nodded, feeling a mix of hope and fear. They were about to take on the hospital's most powerful doctor, and they knew it could cost them their jobs. Or worse. The next day, Lisa's brother Pete met them in a quiet corner of a small diner far from the hospital. He was wearing normal clothes instead of his police uniform to avoid attention. As Jenny showed him all the information they had collected, his face got more and more serious. "This is big," Pete said, running his hand through his hair. "These deaths don't look like accidents to me. We need to watch Dr. Mark very carefully." but we can't let him know we're looking into him. Pete made a plan. He gave Jenny and Lisa small voice recorders that looked like regular pens. "Keep these with you during your shifts," he said. "Record everything Dr. Mark says and does." He also told them to take pictures of any medicine Dr. Mark gave to patients, but to be very careful not to get caught. That night, Jenny was working the late shift when she saw Dr. Mark going into Mr. Green's room. She pretended to be checking other patients nearby while watching him through the door window. Dr. Mark was holding a small bottle she had never seen before. Her hands shook as she pressed the record button on her pen. Just then, Mr. Green woke up and started asking questions about what medicine he was getting. Jenny heard Dr. Mark lie smoothly, saying it was just something to help him sleep better. The next morning, Jenny found Lisa looking worried. "Mr. Green was complaining about feeling strange," Lisa whispered, "just like Mrs. Betty did before she died." They both knew they had to act fast. Jenny went to check Mr. Green's room, but Dr. Mark was already there. He gave Jenny a cold smile that made her skin crawl. "Everything's fine here," he said, standing between her and the patient. "Mr. Green just needs rest." That afternoon, Jenny and Lisa met with Pete again. He had more bad news. "I looked into Dr. Mark's past," Pete said quietly. 3 years ago, at another hospital in a different city, 5 wealthy patients died mysteriously while under his care. But no one could prove anything wrong. Jenny felt her heart beating fast. They were dealing with someone who had done this before and gotten away with it. They needed to stop him before Mr. Green became his next victim. But they had to be smart about it. One wrong move, and Dr. Mark would know they were on to him. That evening, Jenny discovered something that made her blood run cold. While organizing the medicine storage room, she found empty medicine bottles hidden behind some boxes. These weren't normal hospital medicines. They were strong sleeping pills that could stop someone's breathing if given too much. Even scarier, these bottles had their labels partly torn off, like someone was trying to hide what they were. Jenny quickly took pictures of the bottles with her phone and texted them to Pete. While she was putting the bottles back exactly how she found them, she heard footsteps coming closer. Her heart nearly stopped when Dr. Mark walked in. "What are you doing in here so late, Jenny?" he asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jenny's hands were sweating as she held her clipboard. Just doing inventory," she managed to say. "We're running low on some supplies." Dr. Mark stood there watching her for what felt like forever before finally leaving. The next morning, things got worse. Mr. Green was getting weaker, just like the other patients before they died. "I don't understand," he told Jenny weakly when she checked on him. "I was feeling better yesterday, but now everything's fuzzy." Jenny noticed a new IV bag hanging by his bed, one that hadn't been there during her last check. She carefully took a small sample of the liquid, while pretending to adjust the drip, just like Pete had taught her. Later that day, Jenny and Lisa watched Dr. Mark from the nurse's station. He was talking to a new patient, Mrs. Helen White, who had just been admitted. They overheard him asking about her family and her house by the lake. "My children are all busy with their own lives," Mrs. White said sadly. "They rarely visit." Dr. Mark's eyes lit up in a way that made Jenny feel sick. She recognized that look. It was the same one he had when talking to his previous victims. That night, Jenny, Lisa, and Pete met in Pete's small office at the police station. The lab results from the IV bag sample had come back. There were traces of those sleeping pills in the bag, Pete said gravely. "But it's not enough proof to arrest him yet. We need to catch him in the act." They spent hours making a plan. Pete would hide a tiny camera in Mr. Green's room, and the hospital security guard, who was Pete's friend, would help them watch Dr. Mark's movements. As Jenny drove home that night, she noticed a black car following her. She took different turns to make sure, and the car stayed behind her. When she finally parked near her apartment, the car drove past slowly. In the streetlight, she caught a glimpse of the driver. It was Dr. Mark. He knew they were watching him, and now he was watching them too. Jenny's hands trembled as she called Pete. Their time was running out, and the game had become much more dangerous. The next morning was tense at the hospital. Dr. Mark was acting normal, but Jenny could feel his eyes following her everywhere she went. When she checked on Mr. Green, he was even weaker than before. "Jenny," he whispered, holding her hand, "I think someone's trying to hurt me. Last night, I woke up and saw a shadow standing over my bed with a needle." Jenny's heart started racing. She had been right all along. Lisa came running to Jenny during lunch break. She was pale and shaking. "You won't believe what I just found," she said, pulling Jenny into an empty supply closet. Lisa showed Jenny some papers she had discovered while cleaning Dr. Mark's office. They were bank statements showing large amounts of money being transferred to his account right after each patient died. Next to Mrs. Betty's name was a note. "Will, changed 3 days before death." Jenny and Lisa worked quickly to make copies of everything. But when they were putting the papers back, they heard keys jingling outside the office door. They barely managed to slip out through the back door before Dr. Mark walked in. Later, they found out he had changed his entire schedule without telling anyone. He wasn't supposed to be back for hours. That afternoon, something even scarier happened. The hospital security guard who was helping them suddenly got very sick after drinking his coffee. Someone had put something in it. He had to be taken to the emergency room. Now they had lost their eyes inside the hospital. "This is getting too dangerous," Pete told them on the phone. "Dr. Mark knows we're on to him. He's trying to scare us away." Jenny went to check on Mrs. Helen White, the new patient. But when she got to the room, Mrs. White was crying. "Dr. Mark just left," she sobbed. "He made me sign some papers. He said it was just hospital forms, but I couldn't read them well without my glasses." Jenny's stomach dropped. She was sure they were will papers, just like with the other patients. That night, Jenny couldn't sleep again. She kept thinking about all the patients who had died, about Mr. Green getting weaker, and about Mrs. White signing those papers. She knew Dr. Mark would try to kill again soon, but now he was watching them too, and he had all the power at the hospital. Jenny looked at her phone, wanting to quit and run away. Then she saw an old photo of herself with Mrs. Betty, taken just days before she died. In the picture, Mrs. Betty was smiling and holding Jenny's hand. Jenny knew she couldn't give up. She had to stop Dr. Mark, no matter how scary it was. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was Lisa, and she was panicking. "Jenny, come quick! Dr. Mark just went into Mr. Green's room with a strange bottle. He's going to do it tonight." Jenny rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding. She had called Pete on the way, and he was sending police officers, but they would take at least 15 minutes to arrive. Every second counted. When she got to Mr. Green's floor, the halls were dark and quiet. Too quiet. The night nurse, who was supposed to be at the desk, was nowhere to be seen. Through the window of Mr. Green's room, Jenny saw Dr. Mark standing over the bed with a syringe. Mr. Green was asleep, not knowing the danger he was in. Jenny's hands were shaking as she took out her phone and started recording. Just then, Lisa appeared at the other end of the hall, giving Jenny a silent nod. They had practiced this plan earlier. Lisa would be the backup if something went wrong. Jenny took a deep breath and walked into the room. "Dr. Mark," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady, "step away from that patient." Dr. Mark turned around slowly, still holding the syringe. His friendly smile was gone, replaced by a cold, angry look that Jenny had never seen before. "Nurse Jenny," he said quietly, "you should have stayed out of this. Some things are better left alone." "I know about everything," Jenny said, moving closer. "The changed wills, the bank transfers, the hidden medicine bottles. We have proof." For a moment, Dr. Mark's face showed surprise, but then he laughed. A horrible, empty laugh that made Jenny's skin crawl. "Proof?" he said. "I'm the most respected doctor in this hospital. Who do you think they'll believe? A simple nurse or me?" Suddenly, Dr. Mark moved toward Mr. Green with the syringe. Jenny ran forward and grabbed his arm. They struggled, knocking over the IV stand. The noise woke up Mr. Green, who started shouting for help. Dr. Mark was stronger than Jenny, and he pushed her hard against the wall. As she fell, her phone slid across the floor, still recording everything. Lisa ran in to help, but Dr. Mark had another syringe ready. "One more step," he threatened, "and I'll say, you both attacked me. I had to defend myself. Such a shame. 2 young nurses stealing medicine, getting violent when caught. His voice was cold and calculating. Jenny realized with horror that he had planned this too. He would make their deaths look like a drug-related incident. Just then, they heard running footsteps in the hall. Dr. Mark's face changed. For the first time, he looked worried. But instead of running, he moved faster, more desperate. He lunged toward Mr. Green with the syringe. Jenny, still on the floor, grabbed his leg. Lisa ran to press the emergency call button. The room was chaos of shouts and struggles. Through the noise, Jenny heard a loud, clear voice. "Freeze! Police!" Pete and two other officers burst into the room, guns drawn. Dr. Mark tried to throw the syringe out the window, but he was too late. They had seen everything. As the officers handcuffed him, Jenny noticed something fall from his pocket. A small notebook. Inside were dates, names, and amounts of money, all written in his own handwriting. He had kept records of every patient he had killed, thinking he would never be caught. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, news reporters, and hospital investigations. Jenny had to tell her story many times, showing all the evidence they had collected. The small voice recorder pen had caught everything. Dr. Mark's confession, his threats, and the struggle in Mr. Green's room. The notebook found in his pocket turned out to be even more important than they thought. It didn't just have names from this hospital, but from 3 other hospitals where he had worked before. Mr. Green was getting better now that he was receiving the right medicine. He hugged Jenny tightly when she told him how close he had come to being another victim. Mrs. Helen White cried with relief when the police helped her cancel the papers Dr. Mark had made her sign. The families of his past victims started coming forward, sharing stories that were all terribly similar. One morning, Jenny found Lisa sitting alone in the break room, looking at old patient files. "Look at this," Lisa said softly, showing Jenny a photo. It was Dr. Mark at his first hospital job 15 years ago. Even then, his smile didn't reach his eyes. They counted the dates. He might have killed more than 20 people over the years. Each time someone got suspicious, he would simply move to another hospital, change his pattern a little, and start again. The police searched Dr. Mark's house and found even more evidence. He had kept small things from each victim. Mrs. Betty's reading glasses, Mr. Davis's watch, Mrs. Brown's silver necklace. He had their wedding rings in a special box, like trophies. In his computer, they found files tracking their bank accounts and properties. Everything had been planned so carefully. The hardest part was meeting with the families of those who had died. Jenny and Lisa sat with them as Pete explained everything. Some cried, others were angry, but all of them had the same question. How did no one notice for so long? Jenny thought about how Dr. Mark had used his position and reputation to hide his crimes. People trusted doctors so much that they didn't question when things went wrong. One evening, as Jenny was leaving the hospital, she saw new security cameras being installed. The hospital was changing its rules about night shifts and medicine storage. "Your bravery changed things," her supervisor told her. "You saved lives, not just Mr. Green's, but future patients too." Jenny nodded, but she was thinking about Mrs. Betty's last note. If she hadn't written it, if Jenny hadn't found it, Dr. Mark might still be killing people. That night, at home, Jenny looked at her nurse's badge. The job felt different now. She knew that being a nurse meant more than just taking care of patients. It meant protecting them too, even from those who were supposed to help them. 3 months later, the trial of Dr. Mark began. The courthouse was packed with families of his victims, reporters, and hospital staff. Jenny sat in the front row with Lisa and Pete, her hands shaking as she waited to testify. Dr. Mark looked different now. His expensive suits were replaced by prison clothes, but his eyes were still cold and empty when he looked at Jenny. One by one, the evidence was shown in court. The recordings from Jenny's pen played clearly through the speakers, Dr. Mark's voice threatening her and Lisa, the sounds of struggle in Mr. Green's room. The families gasped when they saw pictures of their loved ones' belongings found in his house. The bank records showed how he had stolen millions of dollars over the years, making patients change their wills just before killing them. Mr. Green's testimony was powerful. He described how he had felt his strength draining away each night, how he had seen Dr. Mark standing over him with strange medicines. Mrs. White told the court about being tricked into signing papers when she didn't have her glasses. Other nurses from previous hospitals came forward, saying they had noticed strange things, but had been too scared to speak up. When it was Jenny's turn to testify, she felt everyone's eyes on her. She told the whole story, finding Mrs. Betty's note, discovering the pattern of deaths, collecting evidence with Lisa and Pete, and that final night in Mr. Green's room. Dr. Mark's lawyer tried to make her look bad, suggesting she was just seeking attention, but Jenny stayed calm and told the truth. The most shocking moment came when they showed Dr. Mark's private videos. He had recorded himself practicing how to look sad when telling families their loved ones had died. He had rehearsed his stories about natural causes and unexpected complications. In one video, he was laughing while counting money from a dead patient's account. During a break in the trial, Jenny met a young nurse from another hospital who had just started investigating similar deaths there. "I read about you in the news," the nurse said. "You gave me the courage to speak up too." Jenny realized that their story had spread, encouraging other healthcare workers to be more watchful, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Every day brought new surprises, more evidence of Dr. Mark's crimes. Through it all, he showed no regret, no emotion. He just sat there, sometimes smiling slightly, like he was remembering pleasant memories instead of murders. Finally, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the jury came back with their decision. The courtroom was completely silent as the head juror stood up. "On all counts of murder, theft, and medical malpractice, we find the defendant, Dr. Mark, guilty," she announced. The room exploded with emotion, families hugging each other, crying with relief, while Dr. Mark sat there, still showing no feelings. The judge's voice was firm as he gave the sentence: life in prison with no chance of getting out. "You took advantage of the trust people place in doctors," the judge said angrily. "You killed those who looked to you for help. Each life you took was precious, and each family's pain is deep." For the first time, Dr. Mark's calm face cracked a little. He looked scared as the police led him away in handcuffs. After the trial, there was a special ceremony at City Hospital. Pictures of all Dr. Mark's victims were displayed in the main hall. Mrs. Betty smiling with her grandchildren, Mr. Davis fishing at his favorite lake, Mrs. Brown in her garden. The hospital created new rules named after Mrs. Betty Smith, the Betty Smith safety rules, to make sure no doctor or nurse could ever do something like this again. The money Dr. Mark had stolen was given back to the victims' families. Mrs. White used some of her returned money to start a support group for families who had lost loved ones to medical crimes. Mr. Green, now fully recovered, became a patient advocate, helping people understand their rights in hospitals. Jenny found a letter in her mailbox one morning. It was from Mrs. Betty's daughter. "Mom always said you were special," the letter read. "She trusted you, and you proved her right. You turned her death into something that saved others. Thank you for being brave." Jenny sat onto her porch steps, reading the letter over and over, tears rolling down her face. Lisa was promoted to head nurse of the night shift, making sure all medicine was properly checked and recorded. Pete received an award from the police department for solving the case, but more importantly, their story was being taught in nursing schools as an example of how to spot and stop dangerous people in hospitals. 1 year after the trial, Jenny stood in front of a group of new nurses at the hospital. She was teaching them about patient safety, using what she had learned from catching Dr. Mark. Looking at their young, eager faces, she told them, "Sometimes being a good nurse means being brave enough to question things that don't seem right. One small note, one careful observation. One brave action can save many lives." 5 years later, Jenny walked through the familiar halls of City Hospital. Now, as the director of nursing, the Betty Smith safety rules had spread to hospitals across the country. Pictures of Dr. Mark's victims still hung in the hall, but now they were surrounded by fresh flowers that families brought when they visited. The case had changed everything about how hospitals worked. Jenny stopped to straighten Mrs. Betty's picture, remembering that morning when everything started. A young nurse named Sarah came up to her, holding a tablet. "Look at this," Sarah said excitedly. "Last month, a nurse in Texas used our safety system to catch a doctor who was stealing medicine." She said she remembered learning about our case in nursing school. Later that day, Jenny visited the hospital's new training center, named after Lisa, who had moved to teach at a nursing college. The center had special classes teaching nurses and doctors how to spot warning signs of medical crimes. They used Dr. Mark's case as their main example, showing how he picked his victims, how he covered his tracks, and how he was finally caught. At lunch, Pete, now the police chief, met Jenny in the hospital cafeteria. He had more good news. "Remember those old cases we couldn't prove?" he said. "2 more families came forward with evidence. Even from prison, Dr. Mark's crimes are still being discovered." They had found 20 more possible victims from his early years as a doctor. Jenny's phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Green. He had started a website where hospital workers could safely report suspicious behavior. "Over 100 dangerous medical workers caught so far," his message read. "All because you believed Mrs. Betty's note." Mr. Green's website had become famous, helping people all over the world protect patients from harm. That evening, Jenny taught her regular safety class to new hospital workers. She always started by showing them Mrs. Betty's wrinkled note, now carefully preserved in a glass case. "This piece of paper changed everything," she told them. "It reminds us that every patient's voice matters, every worry should be heard, and every strange feeling should be checked." As Jenny drove home that night, she thought about how one small discovery had grown into something so big. The Betty Smith safety rules hadn't just caught bad doctors and nurses. They had changed how hospitals worked, how patients were protected, and how medical workers looked out for each other. Mrs. Betty's last worried note had started a wave of changes that was still growing, saving lives every day.